The ash was cold, but the blood was hot. Briar's fingers, stained gray and black, trembled as she traced the final stroke of the symbol onto the massive wolf's bleeding flank. It was a spiral, ancient and complex, a thing she knew with her bones but not with her mind. It felt like a memory of a song she'd never been taught. A low groan rumbled through the cavern, vibrating up through the stone floor and into her knees. The beast's breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of white pain. His fur, the color of a moonless midnight, was matted with blood and something else. A dark, oily slick that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Ice crawled up the cave walls, glittering like cursed diamonds in the faint light filtering from the entrance. The cold didn't come from the storm raging outside. It came from him. It radiated from the wound, a deep, unnatural chill that made her own blood feel sluggish in her veins. "It won't work," a voice whispered in her mind. It was thin and reedy, the voice of the village healer, Mistress Elspeth, a woman whose pronouncements were treated as law. "You're tracing nonsense, girl. Mud and ash. You'll kill him with your foolishness." Briar squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the phantom words. Elspeth wasn't here. No one was here but her and the dying beast. She dipped her fingers back into the small wooden bowl where she'd mixed cooled ash from their tiny, sputtering fire with melted snow. The paste was gritty and cold. Her hands were numb, clumsy things at the ends of her arms. She began a new symbol, this one like a stylized bird with a broken wing. The shape flowed from her, an instinct she couldn't name. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the slow, fading beat of the great heart beneath her hand. Another voice surfaced, softer, older. It sounded like lavender and wood smoke, the ghost scent of her grandmother. "It is not nonsense, little bird. It is a tongue long lost." Briar's breath hitched. She hadn't heard that voice in 15 years, not since her grandmother had been laid to rest in the frozen earth. The beast shuddered, a tremor that shook his entire enormous frame. A fresh wave of cold poured from him, so intense it felt like a physical blow. The small fire she'd managed to build in the corner of the cave guttered and died, starved of heat. They were plunged into near darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the numb fog of her exhaustion. She was alone in the dark with a creature that could tear her apart with a single snap of its jaws, a creature whose very life force was being replaced by a creeping, killing frost. And she was trying to save him with drawings made of dirt. The phantom voice of Elspeth cackled in her memory. "Useless, just like your grandmother, chasing shadows." No. Briar pressed her palm flat against the wolf's side, over the symbols she had drawn. She pushed past the unnatural cold, past the sticky wetness of his blood, and focused on the faint, thready warmth still fighting deep within him. She would not let him die. She didn't know why, but the thought of this magnificent creature falling to the cold was an agony she couldn't bear. She closed her eyes and began to hum, a low, broken tune. It was the melody that went with the symbols, the other half of the forgotten song, 3 months earlier. The rain was a cold, relentless misery, soaking through the thin wool of Briar's cloak and chilling her to the bone. She kept her head down, her world reduced to the muddy path and the worn leather of her boots. The village of Greywood huddled under the shadow of the mountains, a place of damp stone and damper spirits. Whispers followed her like stray dogs. "There she is. The mother's a true healer, but the daughter, touched. Barren ground, that one. Nothing good grows." She was used to it. The words were stones worn smooth with repetition. They had long ago lost their sharp edges, leaving only a dull, constant ache of worthlessness. Her mother, Morwen, was the source of those whispers. Morwen, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, who could set a bone or brew a fever balm with an unerring skill that the village revered, and who, in the privacy of their small cottage, could dismantle her daughter's spirit with that same chilling precision. "Your hands are clumsy, Briar," she would say, watching Briar try to grind herbs. "You have none of the sight. You feel nothing of the green. You are a pale imitation, a shadow. Be grateful I allow you to sweep the floors." So Briar swept, and she fetched water, and she learned to make herself small and quiet, to live in the margins of her mother's life. Her only solace was the woods, the deep, ancient forest that climbed the mountain slopes. Her mother forbade her from going too deep, calling the high woods blighted. But it was there that Briar found a strange peace. The trees didn't judge. The animals didn't whisper. She had a knack for finding the wounded ones, a fox with its leg caught in a snare, a young hawk fallen from its nest. She would tend to them with a gentle patience she was never shown herself, using the simple remedies her grandmother had taught her in secret, long ago. Poultices of yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark for pain, little magics. Kitchen magics. Nothing like her mother's powerful craft. That day, the rain had a bitter edge, promising a turn to sleet. A storm was rolling down from the Dragon's Tooth Peaks, a bad one. Morwen had sent her out for river kelp, a task she despised. It meant kneeling in the frigid, fast-moving water, her hands turning blue as she pulled the slimy green strands from the rocks. As she worked, her fingers raw and aching, she saw him. Not a man, but a wolf. He stood on the opposite bank, half hidden by the mist and the drooping fronds of a willow tree. He was enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, with a coat as black as wet slate. He wasn't watching the river. He was watching her. There was an intelligence in his gaze, a stillness that was utterly unnerving. Wolves were common enough in the high woods, but they never came this close to the village. They were shy, fearful creatures. This one was not fearful. He stood like a king surveying his domain. Her heart stuttered. Fear was a familiar companion, but this was different. It wasn't the fear of being hurt, but the fear of being seen, truly seen. She felt stripped bare under that amber gaze, as if he could see all the broken, useless pieces of her. She yanked another handful of kelp from the rock, her movements jerky. When she looked up again, he was gone. The opposite bank was empty, as if he had been a figment of the mist, but the feeling of his eyes on her remained, a prickling heat on the back of her neck. She hurried back to the cottage, her basket heavy, her mind racing. Morwen snatched the basket from her without a word of thanks. "You're dripping on the floorboards, and you took long enough. The storm is almost on us. Did you dawdle again?" "No, Mother." "Don't lie to me, Briar. Laziness is a weed that grows in barren soil." Morwen's eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept over her daughter. "There's a wild look about you. Get yourself clean. The elder is coming for his draft. I won't have you frightening the clientele." Briar retreated to the small, curtained-off alcove that served as her room. She changed out of her wet clothes, her body shivering. The image of the black wolf was burned into her mind. The power she had felt from him, the sheer presence of him, lingered like a scent in the air. It was a scent of pine and cold stone, and something else, something ancient and wild that called to a part of her she didn't know existed, a part of her that was tired of being small. The storm broke that night with a fury that rattled the cottage to its foundations. Wind screamed like a banshee through the eaves, and rain hammered against the wooden shutters. Briar lay on her thin straw mattress, listening, and thought of the wolf. She hoped he had found shelter. The irrational worry was a small, warm thing in the cold space of her chest. The next morning, the world was washed clean and broken. Branches littered the village paths, and the river was a churning brown torrent. Morwen was in a foul mood. The storm had flattened her prized patch of night-flowering moonlace. "Useless," she muttered, staring at the ruined plants. "Everything I try to cultivate turns to rot." Her gaze slid to Briar, and the implication was clear. An idea, reckless and defiant, took root in Briar's mind. There was another patch of moonlace. She was almost certain of it. Her grandmother had shown it to her once, a long time ago. It grew in the shadow of the old ruins, high up the mountain, deep in the forbidden woods. A place her mother would never go. If she could bring back the moonlace, just once, maybe her mother would look at her with something other than disappointment. Maybe she would see that Briar wasn't completely barren ground. The hope was a foolish, fragile thing, but it was enough. While Morwen was busy delivering a tonic in the village, Briar slipped away. She packed a small satchel with a water skin, a chunk of hard bread, and a knife. The air was cold and damp, the sky a bruised purple gray. The woods were strangely silent after the storm. The usual chatter of birds and squirrels hushed. The higher she climbed, the wilder the forest became. The familiar beeches and oaks gave way to towering ancient pines that clawed at the sky. A thick carpet of moss deadened her footsteps. This was the place of whispers and warnings, the domain of the Alpha King, Calder, a ruler so fierce and reclusive that he had become a ghost story told to frighten children. They said he was cursed, that his heart was made of ice, that he commanded the winter itself. Briar told herself it was just a story. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the same feeling she'd had at the river. She found the ruins just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. They were older than the village, a tumble of massive, moss-eaten stones that must have once been a fortress or a temple. A sense of immense sadness clung to the place. And there, growing in a sheltered crevice between two fallen pillars, was the moonlace. Its silvery, trumpet-shaped flowers were closed tight against the day, but they were unharmed. A surge of triumph, sharp and sweet, washed through her. She carefully began to dig around the roots, wanting to transplant the entire patch. The soil was soft and loamy. As her fingers worked deeper, they brushed against something hard and smooth. Not a root. She cleared away the dirt. It was stone, but carved stone. A slab, covered in spiraling patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The symbols were hauntingly familiar. They were the patterns her grandmother used to stitch into the borders of her blankets, the ones she would trace onto the windowpane on a frosty morning. The ones Briar sometimes found herself doodling in the dirt with a stick, not knowing why. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The air grew heavy, thick with a power that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A low growl echoed from the shadows within the ruins, a sound of pure agony that vibrated deep in her chest. It was not the growl of a predator. It was the sound of a creature in its death throes. Her hard-won courage warred with her healer's instinct. Every rational thought screamed at her to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But the sound of that pain, it was a hook in her soul. She couldn't leave it. Clutching her knife, her knuckles white, she crept toward the darkest part of the ruins, a gaping archway that led into what might have been a great hall. The smell hit her first. The coppery tang of blood, sharp and overwhelming, mixed with the bone-deep chill of a winter that had no right to be here in early autumn. She stepped through the archway, and her world fell away. He lay on the stone floor, the great black wolf from the river. He was even larger up close, a creature of myth and nightmare. A deep, ragged gash tore across his side, but the blood flowing from it wasn't just red. It was mixed with that vile black slick, and where it pooled on the floor, a thin rime of frost was forming. He lifted his massive head, his amber eyes clouded with pain. A weak snarl rumbled in his chest, but it held no threat. It was a plea. Briar dropped her knife. It clattered on the stone, the sound shockingly loud in the sudden silence. The moonlace, her foolish hope of earning her mother's approval, was forgotten. All she could see was him, this magnificent, dying king. She took a hesitant step forward. He didn't move, just watched her, his breathing shallow and ragged. The cold intensified, a living thing that sought to steal the breath from her lungs. This was him, the Alpha King, the ghost story, Calder, and he was dying on the floor of his own forgotten castle. She knelt beside him, her fear replaced by a fierce protective surge of compassion. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her healer's bag was meager, holding little more than dried yarrow and moss bandages. It would be like trying to patch a warship with a handkerchief, but she had to try. She reached out, her hand hovering over the terrible wound. The cold flowing from it was a physical force. She could feel the life draining out of him, being consumed by this unnatural winter. He flinched as her fingers brushed his fur, but he didn't snap. He just let out a low whine, a sound so full of despair it broke her heart. And so she began. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water from her skin. She packed it with yarrow to slow the bleeding. She wrapped it with the softest moss. Her actions were small, inadequate, but they were all she had. Days bled into one another in the cold, gray twilight of the ruins. The storm passed, but a deeper winter held sway within those crumbling walls. Briar tended to the Wolf King, her life shrinking to the singular purpose of keeping him alive. She ventured out only to find water and edible roots. She built a small fire that fought a losing battle against the encroaching cold that radiated from him. He never shifted. He remained in his wolf form, too weak, too close to death. He watched her constantly with those intelligent amber eyes. He watched her as she changed his dressings, as she coaxed him to drink water from her cupped hands, as she huddled by the fire, shivering. She talked to him. She filled the echoing silence with stories of her childhood, of her grandmother's kindness, of the woods she loved. She told him of her loneliness, of her mother's cruelty, of the feeling of being a ghost in her own life. She poured out all the words she had kept locked inside for years, not knowing if he understood, but feeling for the first time that someone was truly listening. One evening, the fever took him, but it was a fever of ice. His body, already cold, began to radiate a frost so intense that the stone beneath him cracked. Shudders racked his massive frame, and his breathing grew thin and shallow. The black slick in his wound seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Her remedies were useless. The herbs, the bandages, they were nothing against this. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. She had failed. He was going to die. She sat beside him, her hand resting on his great shivering head, and wept. Her tears fell onto his black fur, freezing into tiny crystals. She had known him for only a few days, a silent, wounded beast, but the thought of the world without him in it was unbearable. As she sat there broken, a memory surfaced. Her grandmother humming by the fire, her fingers tracing patterns in the hearth ash, a lullaby in a language Briar had never learned but somehow knew. An idea, born of desperation and forgotten love, sparked in the darkness. She scrambled to the fire pit. The flames were nearly dead, but a bed of gray ash remained. She scooped a handful into a broken piece of pottery, mixed it with melted snow, and returned to his side. This was the moment the future had already shown her, the moment she was living and the moment she was remembering. She dipped her trembling fingers into the paste. The ash was cold, but the blood was hot. She began to draw, letting the ancient shapes flow from her fingertips onto his fur, around the edges of the wound. The voice of her grandmother whispered, a warm breath against the killing cold. "It is a tongue long lost." As she completed the final symbol, she pressed her palm flat against them. She ignored the ice, the pain, the biting cold. She focused on the tiny, stubborn spark of life deep within him, and she hummed the forgotten lullaby. For a moment, nothing happened. The cold deepened. The last of the fire died. Then, under her hand, a light began to glow. It was not a bright light, but a soft golden luminescence outlining the symbol she had drawn. A wave of warmth, pure and profound, flowed from her palm into the wolf's body. It was not fire heat, it was life heat. It was the warmth of sunshine on new leaves, of a heart beating strong and steady. The wolf's shudders eased. The frost on his fur began to melt. The golden light spread, a network of glowing veins pushing back the darkness, driving the oily black slick from the wound. A hiss, like water on hot stone, filled the air as the unnatural cold was burned away by her touch. Power surged through Briar, a force she had never imagined. It was vast and ancient, a river of knowledge and strength that had been dammed up inside her for years. It was the language of her ancestors, a magic of making and mending, of speaking to the very soul of things. It wasn't barren ground. It was a sleeping forest, waiting for the sun. The light flared, bright as a dawn, and then faded, leaving behind the scent of warm earth and summer rain. The cold was gone. The great wolf took a deep, shuddering breath. And then the shifting began. Bones cracked and reformed. Fur receded. The massive form contracted, twisting in a surge of raw, untamed power. Briar scrambled back, her heart in her throat, watching in stunned awe. Where the wolf had been, a man now lay. He was naked, his body lean and powerful, corded with the muscle of a predator. Scars, old and silver, mapped his skin. His hair was as black as the wolf's pelt, long and wild around a face that was harshly beautiful, all sharp angles and stark planes. He was the most magnificent and dangerous thing she had ever seen. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his movements slow and pained. The wound on his side was still there, but it was clean, the flesh knitting itself back together before her eyes. He looked at her, and his eyes were the same, amber, intense, the eyes of the king. "You," he whispered, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse but deep with an authority that sent a shiver down her spine. Briar couldn't speak. She could only stare, her mind reeling. "The cold," he murmured, looking down at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. He touched the stone floor where the ice had been. It was merely cool and damp now. "It's quiet." He looked back at her, and his gaze was no longer just that of a king surveying his domain. There was confusion in it, and wonder, and a vulnerability that twisted her heart. "Who are you?" "Briar," she managed to say, her voice barely a breath. "Briar," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. He tried to sit up further and grimaced, a hand going to his side. Instinct took over. She moved forward, forgetting her fear. "You shouldn't move. You're not fully healed." She reached for her cloak, which she'd been using as a pillow, and draped it over his shoulders. It was ridiculously small on his broad frame. His skin was warm. Not hot with fever, but a natural, living warmth. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of energy that was both startling and deeply familiar. It was the echo of the magic that had passed between them. He looked at her hand on his shoulder, then back to her face. "What did you do?" I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just drew and hummed." A flicker of something, disbelief, hope, awe, crossed his face. "The old tongue," he breathed. "No one has spoken it in 500 years. He was Calder, the Alpha King. The story was real, and so was the curse." "The wound," she said, her voice finding a bit of its strength. "What was it?" His expression darkened. "An old enemy, a poison that does not kill but replaces. It turns life to ice. I have been fighting it for a century. It has been getting worse. He met her eyes, and the full weight of his loneliness, of 100 years of slow, creeping death, hit her. Nothing has ever pushed it back. Until you. He reached up, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was hesitant, gentle, a stark contrast to the immense power she knew he possessed. It was the touch of a man who had forgotten what it felt to be gentle. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why would you help me? You should have run." "I couldn't," she said simply. "You were in pain." A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken things. The bond that had formed while he was a wolf, the trust built in silence and shared vulnerability, was still there. But now it was something more. It was charged with a new terrifying intensity. He was a king. She was nothing. A village outcast. A disappointment. But she had healed a king with a forgotten magic she didn't know she possessed. The foundation of her world, the belief in her own worthlessness, had cracked. "You need to rest," she said, pulling back, suddenly shy. "And you need food." For the next few days, a new, tentative rhythm was established. Calder regained his strength with astonishing speed. The wound was little more than a pale scar. He was quiet, watchful, his presence filling the ruins. He dressed in spare clothes he retrieved from a hidden cache, simple leather breeches and a tunic that did little to hide the formidable power of his body. He asked her about the symbols, about the song. She told him what little she knew, of her grandmother, of the strange instincts she had always suppressed. "She was one of the keepers," he said, his voice laced with reverence. "They were the lore masters of my line, the ones who held the balance. We thought they had all perished in the frozen war." He told her of the war, of the sorcerer who had laid the curse of ice upon his bloodline, a curse that fed on his life force, growing stronger with each passing year. He had ruled from a distance, hiding his weakness, letting the world believe he was cold and ruthless, because the truth was far more dangerous. If his enemies knew how close he was to falling, the kingdom would shatter. As they talked, the distance between them shrank. She saw not the fearsome king of legend, but a man burdened by immense duty and profound loneliness. And he, in turn, looked at her not as a useless girl, but as a miracle. "You are not barren ground, Briar," he told her one evening, his voice soft but absolute as he watched her tend the fire. "You are a hidden spring in a wasteland." His words were water on the parched soil of her soul. One morning she woke to find him standing at the entrance to the ruins, staring out at the mountains. He was dressed for travel. "It is time," he said, without turning. "My pack will think I am dead. The wolves of the north will be testing the borders. I must go back." Briar's heart plummeted. Of course he had to leave. He was a king. This strange, magical interlude was over. She would go back to her village, to her mother, to being nothing. The thought was a physical pain. "I understand," she said, her voice tight. He turned then, and the look on his face stopped her breath. It was fierce, possessive, and utterly certain. "You are coming with me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I can't," she stammered. "I'm no one. My place is—" "Your place is with me," he cut in, striding toward her. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. "Briar, you carry the old tongue. You hold the only known cure for my curse. But more than that—" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "More than that, when you touch me, the world feels right." The silence in my head stops. For the first time in a century, I am not alone in my own skin. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. I am not leaving you behind. Before she could process it, before she could argue, a voice sharp and cold as breaking glass echoed from the forest. Briar, get away from that beast. Briar froze, the blood draining from her face. Morwen stood at the edge of the trees, her face a mask of cold fury. She was not alone. Two of the village's burliest hunters flanked her, their expressions grim, their bows half drawn. Mother, Briar breathed, a knot of ice forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with Calder's curse. I knew you were hiding something, Morwen spat, her eyes flicking from Briar to Calder, filled with a venomous hatred. Sneaking off to consort with monsters. You have shamed me. You have shamed our line. Calder stepped in front of Briar, shielding her with his body. His posture shifted, the quiet man disappearing, replaced instantly by the Alpha King. His power rolled off him in palpable waves, a pressure that made the air crackle. The hunters took an involuntary step back, their eyes wide with terror. You will not speak to her that way. Calder's voice was a low growl, the sound of an avalanche waiting to happen. Morwen didn't flinch. She laughed, a thin, ugly sound. Her? You think she is something special? I know what she is, Your Majesty. I am her mother. She is a flaw, a mistake, a vessel for a power that should have died out. What are you talking about? Briar demanded, her voice shaking. The Keeper's blood runs thin and weak in you, child, Morwen said with a cruel smile. I did what I had to do to protect you, to protect us. I bound your gift when you were a babe. I made sure you would be nothing, feel nothing. It was a mercy. The words hit Briar like stones. All the years of being told she was worthless, clumsy, barren, it had all been a lie, a cage built around her by her own mother. You didn't protect me, Briar whispered, the horror dawning. You crippled me. I saved you, Morwen shrieked, her composure cracking. That power is a beacon. It calls to things that should remain sleeping. The one who cursed the king's line. Our ancestors served him. They were tasked with ensuring the curse held. Our survival depended on the king's weakness. By healing him, you have doomed us all. Calder went rigid. You serve the shadow sorcerer. I serve survival, Morwen corrected, her eyes glittering with fanaticism. And now, I will correct my daughter's mistake. I will finish what was started a century ago. She raised her hands, and the shadows around her seemed to deepen, to coalesce. A dark, cold energy, a twisted mockery of the life-giving warmth Briar had wielded, swirled around her. It was the same energy that had poisoned Calder's wound. Mother, no! Briar cried. Morwen chanted in a guttural language, and a bolt of black ice shot from her hands, aimed not at Calder, but at Briar. Calder moved faster than thought, intercepting the blast with his own body. He roared in agony as it struck him, the unnatural cold flaring through him. He staggered, falling to one knee, his face contorted in pain. The freshly healed scar on his side tore open, not bleeding red, but weeping the black, frosty slick. Calder! Briar screamed. Now you see, Morwen said, her voice triumphant. He is weak, and you, my dear daughter, are going to help me put him out of his misery. Fear and rage warred within Briar. Her whole life had been a lie. The woman who should have loved her had been her jailer. The man who saw her, truly saw her, was dying at her feet because of her. Something inside her snapped. The dam her mother had built around her heart, around her power, shattered into 1,000 pieces. No, Briar said. Her voice was quiet, but it rang with an authority that made the stones themselves seem to listen. She walked toward her mother, stepping around Calder's kneeling form. She felt the ancient power rise in her, not as a gentle spring, but as a raging flood. It wasn't just the language of healing, it was the language of command, the language of truth. You will not touch him again, she said. Morwen laughed. You cannot stop me. You don't even know what you are? I know that you are a liar, Briar said, raising her hand. And I know that you are afraid. She didn't draw symbols. She didn't hum. She spoke. A single word in the old tongue. It was a word of unmaking. A golden light erupted from her. A sunburst of pure life. It struck Morwen's shadowy shield, and the darkness didn't just break. It dissolved, evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Morwen screamed, stumbling back, clutching her hands as if she had been burned. The dark power receded from her, leaving her looking small and frail. The hunters, terrified, dropped their bows and fled into the woods. Briar stood between her mother and her king, a conduit of ancient power, her face set. She was no longer a shadow. She was the dawn. She turned and knelt before Calder, ignoring her cowering mother. She placed her hands on his chest, over his heart. The curse fought back, a raging winter against her summer. But this time, she was not just humming a lullaby. She was speaking the language of creation. Warmth flooded him. She felt the ice shatter, the poison burn away to nothing, not just from his wound, but from the very root of his soul. She felt the century of cold and pain recede, leaving behind only the strong, steady beat of his heart against her palm. He gasped, his amber eyes flying open. They were clear, free of the shadow of pain for the first time. He looked at her, his expression one of utter, soul-shaking awe. He reached up and tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her gently toward him until their foreheads touched. Briar, he breathed. It wasn't just her name. It was a prayer. It was a promise. It was everything. Weeks later, the wind that swept down from the Dragon's Tooth Peaks was just a wind, no longer carrying the bite of the king's curse. The great hall of Calder's mountain fortress was filled with the warmth of roaring fires and the cautious murmurs of his pack. They had all stared when he returned, not with a bride from a noble line, but with a quiet, unassuming girl from a backwater village. The whispers had started immediately, dismissive and cruel. Then they saw the way he looked at her, as if she were the son he had been denied for 100 years. Morwen was imprisoned, her dark magic broken, her lies exposed to the world. She was no longer a threat, only a sad, bitter woman who had chosen fear over love. Briar felt no triumph in her mother's fall, only a deep, aching pity. One evening, Calder led her to the highest balcony of the fortress. The entire kingdom spread out below them, a tapestry of dark forests and silver rivers under a sky littered with stars. It feels different, he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. The land. It can breathe again. It was dying with me. It's healing, she said, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. She felt his heart beat against her back, a steady, comforting rhythm. We are healing, he corrected softly. He placed his hand over hers on the cold stone of the railing. His touch was no longer just warm. It was alive with a vibrant energy that resonated with her own. Their magics, the ice and the sun, had found a balance. I spent a century believing that my power was a curse that would destroy me, he said. And you spent a lifetime believing you had no power at all. She turned in his arms to face him. The moonlight silvered the sharp planes of his face, softening the harsh lines. My grandmother used to say that every living thing has a song, she whispered. My mother tried to steal mine, but you heard it, even when I was silent. Your song, Briar, he said, his amber eyes burning with an emotion so intense it made her whole body ache with love. It is the only music I ever want to hear. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or of relief. It was a kiss of belonging. It was the quiet, certain joy of two broken halves finally finding their whole, a promise whispered not in words, but in the silent, perfect language of the soul. She was home. He was home. And the long winter was finally over.